The Siege of Malta is often remembered for its relentless air raids and the courage of its defenders, but hidden within that broader narrative lies a lesser-known episode, one involving a forgotten airstrip, a small detachment of pilots, and an operation shrouded in silence. In early 1942, as the island endured some of the heaviest bombing of the Second World War, a makeshift satellite airfield was carved out of dusty Maltese soil near Hal Far. It was meant to be temporary, improvised, and highly secretive. Few outside the RAF's immediate command ever knew it existed. Yet from this isolated strip of limestone and rubble, a handful of pilots from No. 249 Squadron RAF were ordered to fly missions under extraordinary pressure. Malta's greatest struggle that spring was survival. Axis planners sought to bomb the island into submission, aiming to neutralize its strategic importance in controlling the central Mediterranean. The main airfields, Tokaji, Lucca, and Hal Far, were pounded daily by Junkers Ju-88s and Stuka dive bombers. Aircraft were often destroyed before they could leave the ground. The idea behind the satellite strip was simple: scatter the fighters so the Luftwaffe could not eliminate them in a single blow. But dispersal came with its own challenges. The strip lacked proper facilities, its surface was rough, and the men stationed there worked under constant threat of discovery. Still, the RAF had no choice. To keep Malta flying, every runway mattered. For the detachment assigned to the hidden airfield, the routine was grueling. Pilots slept in small bivouacs or commandeered farmhouses. Ground crew worked through the night by shielded lanterns, refueling and rearming Hurricane Mk2 fighters while listening for the distant hum of enemy bombers. There was no margin for error. "We lived in the dust," one ground mechanic later recalled. "Dust in our clothes, dust in the engines, dust in our teeth. Everything rattled. Everything felt exposed." But despite the hardship, the strip proved useful. Flights could launch from it quickly and unpredictably, complicating Axis intelligence assessments. In early April 1942, the situation intensified. Luftwaffe Field Marshal Albert Kesselring shifted more aircraft to Sicily, determined to break Malta's remaining defenses. RAF directives grew terse and urgent. On the night of April 11th, a coded message arrived ordering a dawn patrol. 4 fighters from the satellite airfield would be sent northward, expected to intercept an early morning raid forming over the Mediterranean. The mission, on paper, was routine. But officers at Hal Far were aware that German reconnaissance had grown sharper. The longer the strip remained active, the greater the chance it would be detected. As the sky darkened, the detachment prepared. The pilots, 3 seasoned men and 1 newcomer recently transferred from Tokaji, checked their maps by dim light. The commanding officer, Flight Lieutenant Andrew Hawks Hawthorne, reviewed radio frequencies and weather conditions. He wrote a short entry in his logbook shortly before midnight: "Dawn patrol. Expecting contact. Fuel tight. Hope for quiet skies." The ground crew, exhausted but focused, finished topping off fuel tanks, their hands stained with oil and abrasive dust. The Hurricanes were lined up under camouflage netting, their silhouettes barely visible against the rocky terrain. By 4:45 on April 12, the horizon began to glow. It was the quietest moment of the day, a brief pause before the first wave of air raid sirens typically broke the stillness. The 4 Hurricanes rolled into position. According to radio logs, Hawthorne's voice crackled over the set: "Dawn patrol. Angels 10. North by northeast." Moments later, the roar of Merlin engines filled the air as the fighters climbed into the pale morning sky. A few ground crew members recalled waving, expecting the patrol to return within an hour. Then, silence. Radio operators at Hal Far reported losing contact just minutes after takeoff. Static interference was common, German jamming was notorious, but the timing felt wrong. Each aircraft was scheduled to check in at defined intervals, a precaution shaped by weeks of combat losses. When the first check-in passed without response, officers attributed it to temporary atmospheric disturbance. When the second passed, unease began to grow. By the third, the detachment realized something was very wrong. To make matters worse, The island came under renewed bombardment shortly after sunrise. Radar screens were overwhelmed with echoes of incoming raids. Command resources were stretched thin. Search efforts that might have begun immediately were delayed by necessity, and as bomb blasts shook the main airfields, the fate of the Dawn Patrol became a secondary concern. A junior engineer later wrote in his diary, "We could barely keep the hurricanes flying. Everything was chaos. And amid it all, 4 men gone, just gone." By late morning, distress solidified into fear. The 4 aircraft had vanished without a trace. No wreckage spotted. No distress calls recorded. No radar readings beyond initial departure. The satellite airfield's small community gathered in confusion, uncertain whether the patrol had been shot down, lost at sea, or diverted by some unknown emergency. And yet, as the day wore on, one thing became clear: the disappearance of the Dawn Patrol was not a routine loss. Something about the timing, the silence, and the complete absence of evidence did not fit the pattern of Malta's typical air battles. The forgotten airfield had launched 4 fighters at dawn. By midday, they had vanished into history, leaving behind only questions. The search for answers begins in Part 2. At first light on April 12, 1942, Malta stood on the edge of another punishing day, but no one expected it to begin with a disappearance. The island's defenders were accustomed to sudden losses. Bombers destroyed on the ground, patrols shot down over the sea, but even in the chaos of daily combat, communication rarely vanished so abruptly. The 4 hurricanes from the satellite strip near Hal Far lifted off at 5:02, engines thundering against a pale, windless sky. Their mission was straightforward: climb to 10,000 feet, sweep north of the island, and intercept a formation suspected to be assembling near the Sicilian coast. Within minutes, the patrol should have checked in. Instead, radio logs recorded a different reality: interference, static, and then nothing at all. In the early hours, German signals units frequently saturated the region with jamming frequencies, masking bomber transmissions and complicating RAF communications. But even heavy interference seldom cut out every channel. The patrol's lead pilot, Flight Lieutenant Hawthorne, had flown dozens of sorties under worse conditions. His calm voice was reassuring, almost habitual. That is what made the silence so unsettling. It wasn't the usual crackle, one radio operator later recalled. It was like the frequency just evaporated, as if no one was transmitting at all. Yet the 4 hurricanes had been seen climbing jointly, maintaining tight formation as they curved northward over the coastline. As the patrol ascended, radar operators at Lascaris war rooms tracked their initial movement on the outdated but functional British GL, gun-laying, radar. The blip was faint, hurricanes presented small signatures, but the operators noted a clean climb to roughly 8,000 feet. Then, as the fighters crossed beyond the narrow northern radar arc, the track flickered and disappeared. Technicians blamed equipment range limitations, not disaster. Radar coverage around Malta was never complete. The island depended heavily on visual observation and pilot reporting. But when the scheduled 5:17 check-in passed, concern began to spread through the operations room. Meanwhile, on the ground at the satellite strip, the quiet of dawn had already turned anxious. Ground crews had dispersed to their makeshift shelters, expecting the usual morning raid targeting the main airfields. Still, they listened for the returning roar of Merlin engines. Familiar, comforting, unmistakable. It never came. At the edge of the runway, one flight mechanic kept glancing toward the horizon, whispering, "They should have come back by now." Such unease was not routine. Dawn patrols almost always reported contact, even if only to signal enemy activity. Further complicating the morning, warning reports flooded the central command. At 6:10, the first wave of Ju-88 bombers crossed toward Malta, accompanied by Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Italian C.202 fighters. Sirens wailed across Valletta and Birgu as bombs fell on Tekeli, sending ground crews scrambling for cover. The operations staff were forced to divert their attention to defending the island. Whatever had happened to the Dawn Patrol, it was temporarily overshadowed by the unfolding crisis. Radar screens continued to register incoming raids, filling the airwaves with urgent communications from defending squadrons. But not everyone forgot the missing flight. At 6:40, a report reached the intelligence tent at Hal Far. A coastal lookout near Delhi Mara had heard distant gunfire over the sea around dawn, short bursts, fading quickly. Normally such observations would be cross-referenced with radar tracks or pilot confirmations, but no such data existed. The Dawn Patrol's last known heading suggested they could have been in that general area. Yet German operational logs captured after the war show no confirmed engagements at that precise time or location. For Malta's defenders, this discrepancy deepened the mystery. Back at the satellite strip, a subtle but chilling detail emerged. The personal belongings of the 4 pilots remained untouched. Everything, a pocket Bible, a neatly folded scarf, a half-written letter home, sat exactly where it had been left before takeoff. Even the spare ammunition magazines still rested on a canvas sheet, organized for rapid rearmament. These men had expected to return quickly. The absence of wreckage or distress signals did not fit the pattern of combat losses. Hurricanes downed near Malta often left debris floating in the water, oil slicks, or parachutes spotted by coastal units. Here, there was nothing. As morning turned to late day, the silence pressed harder on the detachment. Officers attempted to reconstruct the patrol's route, estimating fuel endurance, wind direction, and possible navigational errors. But every calculation led to the same conclusion: the fighters should have been visible somewhere, on radar to search aircraft, or to Allied ships patrolling nearby. Yet no vessel reported sighting aircraft or wreckage. The Mediterranean, vast and unforgiving, had erased every trace. Intelligence officers drafted preliminary notes that afternoon, marking the disappearance as unexplained, further inquiry required. But as the Luftwaffe's bombardment intensified, administrative priorities shifted. Dozens of new damage assessments, casualty lists, and operational directives overwhelmed the system. The Dawn Patrol was increasingly treated as one more tragedy among many. Still, one question lingered. How could 4 experienced pilots, flying serviceable aircraft in clear morning weather, vanish within minutes of takeoff? That question would only deepen in Part 3. By mid-morning on April 12, 1942, the satellite airfield near Hal Far had fallen into a tense quiet. Bombing raids continued over the main bases, but out on the improvised strip carved into the Maltese limestone countryside, the mood was different, unease mixed with disbelief. The 4 Hurricanes that had taken off at dawn had now been missing for hours. The ground crew, hardened by months of attrition, were used to sudden loss. Yet this felt different, inexplicable in a way that combat rarely was. And then came an observation that pushed the situation from concerning to deeply unsettling. The pilots' belongings, left precisely as they had been before takeoff. In maltreated wooden huts and repurposed farm storage rooms, small items sat untouched. Flight Lieutenant Hawthorne's logbook remained open to the previous night's entry. Pilot Officer Reed's goggles hung from a nail above his cot. A tin mug, still half full of weak tea, sat beside the bed of Sergeant Tom Harker, the newcomer to the detachment. These were not the belongings of men preparing for a long or uncertain mission. These were the ordinary traces of pilots expecting to return within the hour. They planned to be home for breakfast, one mechanic silently noted. Their absence felt abrupt, unnatural, not in a supernatural sense, but in a way that defied the normal patterns of wartime loss. While officers considered these observations, reports filtered in from around Malta. A lookout stationed at Fort Tos Silg claimed to have heard short, sharp bursts of aerial gunfire to the northeast just after dawn. Another observer, manning a coastal post near St. Thomas Bay, noted engine sounds high above the haze at roughly the same time. Neither sighting included visual confirmation, only sounds carried over the early morning stillness. Normally, these details would be quickly matched with pilot radio commentary or enemy activity logs, but radio silence made the process speculative. Worse, the Luftwaffe's own engagement reports, obtained after the war, recorded no confirmed clashes in the area during that time window. This mismatch confounded later historians. Was there a brief skirmish that went undocumented? Or had the noises been from another source entirely? What further complicated the developing mystery was the increasing chaos across Malta. As the missing patrol consumed the thoughts of the small satellite detachment, the island's main airfields faced one of their heaviest bombings of April 1942. Tarkali, already cratered beyond easy repair, was hit repeatedly by WWII formations releasing bombs in tight, coordinated waves. Lucca, the island's primary operational base, endured strikes that ignited fuel stores and destroyed several parked aircraft. The defenders could not risk diverting fighters or reconnaissance planes to search for 4 missing Hurricanes, not when Malta's survival hung in the balance. Inside a cramped intelligence tent at Hal Far, 2 officers attempted to piece together the patrol's intended route. Using a grease pencil on a worn map, they traced the projected climb to 10,000 feet and the sweep northward toward the suspected enemy assembly point. The distance was modest. The patrol should have remained within reach of radar or visual spotting for some portion of the mission. Yet no observer reported seeing Hurricanes flying low or struggling with mechanical trouble. The sea that morning was calm, a factor that should have made any debris more visible. And still, nothing emerged. To shed light on the situation, the officers examined mechanical records. All 4 Hurricanes had undergone routine service the evening before. Fuel tanks had been filled, guns fully loaded, and minor maintenance tasks completed with care despite the conditions of the rough airstrip. None of the aircraft were flagged for issues. Their engines, Merlin XX power plants known for reliability, had been running cleanly in previous flights. If mechanical failure had struck one aircraft, it would have been unfortunate but feasible. For all 4 to fail, simultaneously and silently, stretched credibility. One handwritten note from a ground crewman, later found in a box of personal papers donated to a museum, captured the mood of the moment. "We listened," he wrote. "Listened for even a distant hum. Nothing. Empty sky. Like they took off into another world." The words were poetic, not literal, but they reflected an emotional truth. The disappearance broke from wartime patterns in a way the men could not easily rationalize. As officers expanded their assessment, they considered external factors. Could the patrol have misidentified a heading and flown too far north? Could atmospheric distortion have carried sounds of a distant engagement, misleading observers into placing the dogfight closer to Malta than it truly was? Or, more troublingly, had the patrol ventured after a misreported contact, one that drew them beyond fuel range and into the open Mediterranean, where downed aircraft could vanish within minutes? Malta's defenders had seen many pilots lost to the sea. Yet even in those tragic cases, wreckage or a flare was often spotted. A survivor might be hauled aboard by a passing ship. That none of these indicators appeared for all 4 aircraft made the disappearance feel less like a single misfortune and more like a puzzle with missing pieces. By late afternoon, the satellite airfield grew eerily still. Ground crew avoided one another, officers spoke in hushed tones, and the harsh Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the runway where the Hurricanes had launched just hours earlier. "It was as though the morning had swallowed them," another crewman later said. Behind the unease lay a quiet, unresolved question, one that no amount of wartime chaos could entirely bury. Had something happened before the patrol ever engaged the enemy? The search for answers turns inward and deeper in Part 4. By evening on April 12, 1942, the frantic tempo of the day's bombing had finally begun to ease, leaving behind a shattered landscape of cratered runways, burning fuel dumps, and exhausted airmen. But inside Malta's cramped intelligence rooms, the mood was far from quiet. A new set of fragments, small, ambiguous, but impossible to ignore, had reached RAF command. Reports of a brief, unidentified dogfight south of Malta had surfaced, offering the first hint of what might have happened to the missing patrol. Yet as the evidence unfolded, it pointed in conflicting directions, deepening the mystery rather than clarifying it. The first clue arrived from a signal intercepted by Allied listening posts on the island. Early that afternoon, operators monitoring Axis frequencies recorded a short German transmission mentioning, "For fighters sighted." No time, no coordinates, just a passing reference. Surveillance staff flagged it but could not confirm whether the message referred to Hurricanes or to a different engagement entirely. Intercepts were common. Clarity was not. Still, the timing of the note, logged just before 1400 hours, made analysts pause. If the Germans had indeed encountered 4 hurricanes, it would have confirmed an aerial clash. But the position was unknown, and the Luftwaffe rarely acknowledged incomplete engagements in their logs. More intriguing was a late report from a Royal Navy lookout stationed on HMS Abingdon, a minesweeper anchored off Malta's southeast coast. The lookout stated he had seen distant contrails spiraling downward around dawn, far off the horizon. The sighting was too vague to be definitive. The observer himself admitted the first light made the angle difficult to judge, and contrails often dispersed quickly. However, even this ambiguous description suggested aerial combat at roughly the same time the dawn patrol vanished. One officer underlined the report twice in red pencil. Possible engagement? No verified enemy claims. This absence of enemy claims soon became the most baffling part of the emerging picture. Captured Luftwaffe records from the period, reviewed years later, confirmed no German unit claimed hurricanes over the waters south of Malta on April 12. One Me-109 pilot from Jagerschwede 53 even noted in his diary, patrolled dawn sector. No contacts. Returned without engagement. The Italian Regia Aeronautica reported the same. In an era when pilots received commendation for confirmed kills, and squadrons meticulously logged engagements, the silence in Axis documentation was striking. If combat had occurred, neither side registered it. Inside the Lascaris war rooms, intelligence officers laid out all available accounts on a narrow wooden table. On one side were the auditory observations, burst of gunfire, engine noise, possible contrail spirals. On the other side, cold operational facts, no radar confirmation, no Axis claims, no wreckage located. For every piece of evidence suggesting a skirmish, another contradicted it. One senior officer, Wing Commander Edward Marsh, summarized the dilemma bluntly. If they fought, no one saw it. If they didn't fight, what happened? With the possibility of an undocumented engagement still unresolved, investigators turned attention to operational context, hoping a clearer strategic picture might explain the loss. That morning, Luftwaffe units from Sicily had launched multiple raids, mostly focused on Lucca and Tarkali. Some fighter escort groups had briefly shifted southward to adjust their formation, creating confusion on early radar sweeps. This presented a troubling scenario. The dawn patrol may have pursued what they believed was a fragmented enemy formation, pushing farther out to sea than intended. If they misjudged distance or cloud cover, they could have lost visual contact with Malta within minutes. But this explanation also had weaknesses. The weather that morning was unusually clear, with visibility extending more than 10 miles. Sunrise had cast a strong horizontal light across the Mediterranean, making silhouettes distinct. Hawthorne and his men were experienced in these conditions. Navigational error was possible, but for all 4 to stray fatally off course together, without even a distress call, strained credibility. Then came another possibility raised by 2 intelligence officers: misidentification. At dawn, with low-angle light and haze on the horizon, aircraft could appear distorted. What if the patrol had sighted a non-hostile aircraft, a British reconnaissance plane or a returning maritime patrol, and pursued it under the mistaken belief it was the enemy? Such errors had happened before in Malta's compressed airspace. If the pilots chased a phantom contact, the pursuit might have carried them well beyond fuel margins. Yet again, this theory lacked supporting evidence. No Allied aircraft were scheduled in that sector at that hour, and none were reported missing. By sunset, frustration settled over the intelligence teams. They were left with the impression of an event that had occurred but left almost no trace. A shadow conflict, recorded only in echoes and glimpses. What stood out most was the utter absence of debris. The sea had been calm. The morning light was strong. The patrol's expected flight radius was limited. Even a single floating piece of wreckage would have offered some closure. That none was found forced officers to reconsider whether their assumptions about the patrol's final trajectory were accurate at all. One cryptic comment came from a young intelligence corporal assigned to compile the day's final report. As he handed over his typed summary, he remarked, It's as if they were flying in a gap between what we can see and what the enemy can claim. His superior frowned at the phrasing but didn't correct it. The remark captured, unintentionally, the growing sense that the disappearance existed somewhere between known battles and unrecorded moments, a blind spot in the island's wartime fabric. As darkness fell over Malta and the bombers retreated toward Sicily, one thing had become clear. The early assumption of mechanical failure or simple misnavigation no longer held up. Something had happened to the dawn patrol. Something rapid, silent, and unclaimed by either side. In the days ahead, attention would turn away from the skies and toward the airfield itself, and the decisions made there before the patrol ever lifted off. Part 5 begins the shift from battlefield mystery to archival shadows. In the days following April 12, 1942, Malta remained under constant assault, forcing every airman and officer into a punishing rhythm of repair, scramble, and survival. Yet amid this relentless pressure, a quieter transformation took place at the satellite airfield near Hal Far, the small, dust-covered strip from which the dawn patrol had vanished. What had once been an improvised lifeline for dispersing fighters was now becoming a liability. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance flights had begun photographing the southeastern part of the island more aggressively. Any trace of an airstrip, no matter how hastily camouflaged, risked bringing devastating attention. Thus, within 48 hours of the patrol's disappearance, RAF Command issued a terse directive. The satellite strip was to be abandoned. It was not an emotional decision. It was strategic necessity. The Luftwaffe had already learned the patterns of Malta's main airfields, Tekeli, Lucca, and Hal Far, and were hitting them with mathematical precision. A fourth functioning runway, even a crude one, risked exposing the few fighters the RAF still had in service. The satellite strip's value had been secrecy. Once suspicion grew that German intelligence might detect it, secrecy evaporated. Camouflage netting was pulled down, equipment moved by night, and the battered ground crew dispersed back to their parent units. Within a day, the airfield was reduced to what it had been before the war, a patch of empty, wind-swept terrain. But the men who left the strip behind carried with them a deeper burden, an incident that refused to fade into the daily casualty lists and operational summaries. Before departure, intelligence officers conducted a final sweep through the huts, makeshift workshops, and underground shelters. They gathered logbooks, mission sheets, fuel records, and technical reports. Everything related to the missing patrol was collected and forwarded to RAF headquarters. Among these documents were several incomplete notes from the officers on duty that morning, one referencing a possible deviation from assigned route, another mentioning unverified aerial activity southeast of Malta. None provided a clear explanation, but the tone suggested an awareness that the disappearance was more than a typical combat loss. As paperwork accumulated, the disappearance was folded into larger operational reports. Within these files, the Dawn Patrol's fate became a brief line in a growing ledger of wartime losses. For hurricanes missing. Cause unknown. No enemy confirmation. In an environment where convoys were being sunk, civilians were being bombed, and fighter reserves were dwindling, gaps in documentation were inevitable. Even so, certain senior officers were troubled by the lack of closure. Wing Commander Marsh, overseeing air defense coordination at the time, scribbled a marginal note in one report: pattern irregular, requires later review. But any planned follow-up was swept aside by the escalation of the siege. Survival took precedence over investigation. When the satellite strip was finally abandoned, the disappearance began its quiet drift toward obscurity. Ground crew, scattered among new assignments, rarely spoke of it. Pilots replaced their fallen comrades and flew on. And Malta itself, with supply convoys running a gauntlet of submarines, mines and bombers, had little time to dwell on mysteries. Yet traces of the incident persisted in unexpected ways. A mechanic who had serviced the Hurricanes the night before the patrol wrote in his diary, "They were good machines. Sound. Whatever happened, it wasn't the planes." An intelligence officer filed a private memo noting that the absence of enemy claims remained statistically improbable, given typical Luftwaffe record-keeping for the period. The physical airfield, meanwhile, faded swiftly from operational memory. Dust and weeds reclaimed its runway. The temporary huts collapsed under the weight of time and rain. As the siege progressed through 1942 and 1943, new priorities emerged: reinforcements from Operation Bowery, the arrival of Spitfires, and renewed attempts by the Axis to force Malta's surrender. The forgotten airfield slipped into the background of Malta's grander story. Yet after the war, when historians and archivists began piecing together Malta's fragmented wartime records, the incident resurfaced. Boxes retrieved from British storage facilities included obscure mission logs and thin intelligence notebooks from April 1942. Documents that mentioned, almost casually, the missing patrol. A few raised eyebrows. How did 4 aircraft vanish without a trace at dawn during one of the clearest weather mornings of the siege? Why had no wreckage been recovered despite calm seas? And why had Luftwaffe pilots, known for meticulous engagement claims, reported nothing? These questions found no satisfying answers. Instead, they revealed inconsistencies, timelines that didn't align, radar logs missing key entries, and intelligence summaries that seemed to reference events not documented elsewhere. These weren't signs of conspiracy, just the natural scars of wartime record-keeping under siege. But they contributed to an enduring uncertainty that modern researchers still grapple with. One historian who reviewed the rediscovered files in the 1970s wrote, "The loss of the Dawn Patrol falls into that narrow space between documentation and silence, too detailed to dismiss, too incomplete to resolve." His assessment echoed a sentiment long felt by veterans of the satellite strip. The sense that the incident sat on the edge of memory, never fully explained, yet never fully forgotten. By the time interest in the forgotten airfield revived in the late 20th century, much of its physical presence had vanished. But the questions, to which no wartime officer ever offered a definitive answer, remained suspended between fact and uncertainty. And as researchers dug deeper into the surviving records, one thread emerged repeatedly: the suspicion that the Dawn Patrol may not have followed the route written in their orders. Part 6 follows the trail of the archival rediscoveries, and the unanswered questions they raised decades later. Decades after the siege of Malta had faded into the broader tapestry of World War II history, a graduate researcher working through a dusty archive in Kew stumbled upon a thin, misfiled folder. Inside were several short intelligence memos from April 1942. Documents that referenced, in terse wartime handwriting, the disappearance of 4 Hurricanes from a satellite strip near Hal Far. The rediscovery of these notes sparked a fresh investigation, one that would pull historians into a maze of contradictory reports, overlooked logs, and operational ambiguities. The more they uncovered, the clearer one unsettling truth became. The story of the vanished squadron had never been fully resolved, not in 1942 and not in the years that followed. What emerged first was the realization that the mission orders for the Dawn Patrol had been revised late on the night of April 11th. A brief notation, likely made by a junior officer, indicated a possible adjustment to the patrol sector due to shifting radar readings of Axis activity north of Malta. The revision was small, but significant. Rather than sweeping directly north, the patrol was to angle slightly northeast before turning into its main intercept pattern. The change was not reflected in the standard mission sheet. It appeared only in the margin of a hastily written operations note. Historians wondered whether the pilots had seen the update. The handwriting was faint, the time unclear. If the correction had been delivered verbally or rushed through the chain of command, miscommunication was plausible. Still, this alone did not explain the total lack of radio contact. Another document, an intelligence summary drafted 2 weeks after the incident, suggested that a misinterpreted earlier radar echo may have sent the patrol farther off course than intended. Wartime British radar operators in Malta were skilled but overworked, often tracking dozens of signals through interference and haze. A phantom contact, or what the operators later called a ghost echo, may have been reported near the northeastern sector. If the patrol diverted toward a non-existent formation, they might have flown beyond supportive radar arcs before anyone realized the mistake. Yet even that scenario raised further questions. The pilots carried enough fuel for approximately 90 minutes of flight under standard conditions. They should have returned by 6:20 at the latest. If they became lost or pursued a misread radar track too far out to sea, fuel starvation would have forced ditching. Such accidents, tragic as they were, typically left debris visible to pilots, ships, or coastal lookouts. In this case, no such evidence ever surfaced. Nothing washed ashore, nothing spotted by ships patrolling convoy routes, nothing marked in naval logs. The Mediterranean, calm on the morning in question, offered no clues. Another thread emerged from a decrypted note referencing Allied signals analysis. A fragment of a German transmission intercepted at dawn mentioned, for aircraft turning south, but the transmission cut off before the coordinates were given. Analysts could never determine whether this referred to the hurricanes or another flight entirely. Nevertheless, the mention of a southern turn puzzled historians, because it contradicted the patrol's assigned route. If true, it implied the hurricanes had deviated sharply, either by choice or confusion, within minutes of takeoff. The direction made little sense tactically. South of Malta lay open sea with little strategic significance for that particular patrol. If the pilots had turned south, it would represent a major navigational error or a response to an unexpected sighting. Some researchers proposed another explanation: misidentification of friendly aircraft. A returning RAF Maryland reconnaissance aircraft had flown near the southeastern sector at dawn, although its exact time and altitude differed slightly from the patrol's. If the hurricanes encountered it in the low-angle morning light, silhouettes and wing shapes could have been difficult to distinguish. Pursuing a mistaken contact out to sea was not unprecedented in Malta's crowded airspace. But this theory, too, had problems. The Maryland crew never reported any British fighters shadowing them, and ground logs placed the reconnaissance plane closer to Lucca during the dawn window. As historians dug deeper, one detail persisted across multiple recovered documents: a sense of haste. The satellite airfield was operating under extreme pressure, its personnel sleep-deprived, its procedures compressed. Orders changed quickly. Briefings were sometimes conducted outdoors under camouflage netting, and radio equipment, hastily repaired after repeated bombings, was prone to malfunction. In such an environment, even small errors, misheard headings, incorrect altimeter settings, or faulty signal calibration, could multiply rapidly. The disappearance may not have stemmed from any single mistake, but rather from a cascade of them. And yet, none of the explanations fit neatly. There was evidence for multiple possible scenarios, but proof for none. Even after 70 years, historians could not reconstruct the final minutes of the Dawn Patrol's flight with certainty. What remained was a collection of possibilities: navigational error, phantom radar echo, pursuit of a misidentified aircraft, or an undocumented clash with the enemy. Each theory accounted for some of the evidence but contradicted other parts. The last known document referencing the incident came from a post-war RAF officer reviewing Malta operations for a historical monograph. His conclusion was measured, understated, and painfully honest. The disappearance of the 4 hurricanes on April 12, 1942 must be regarded as unresolved. The conditions of war, the limitations of technology, and the pressures faced by the island all contributed to gaps in our knowledge. Their loss, though overshadowed by greater battles, represents one of the small but poignant mysteries of Malta's defense. Today, the forgotten airfield near Hal Far is little more than scattered stone foundations and uneven ground, softened by time and overgrowth. Yet for those who walk the site, the absence of visible remains contradicts the weight of its history. For pilots launched from that strip at dawn on a clear April morning, men with names, routines, and expectations. They left behind a half-full tin mug, a folded letter, a logbook open to the previous night's entry. And then they vanished into a war where even the smallest events could slip through the cracks of memory and record. The lesson lingering at the edge of this story is not one of conspiracy or hidden agendas. It is the quieter truth that in the chaos of World War II, not every question found an answer. Some stories, like the Squadron that vanished at dawn, remain suspended between documentation and silence, testaments to the limits of what history can recover, and to the men whose final chapter was written in the skies above a besieged island.